we need to dramatically reinvigorate our defense industrial base so that we can produce the sheer material needed to project force. But we're not there right now.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
To the Middle East now, and more than 50,000 people have been killed in the Gaza Strip since the war began. That's according to the territory's Hamas-run health ministry.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battlelines. It is Monday, the 21st of July, 2025. The hypothetical Chinese invasion of Taiwan is perhaps the greatest what-if of contemporary foreign policy. In the second half of this podcast, we'll be exploring how that threat is shaping events as far away as Washington, Ukraine, Israel, and Australia. But first, to Taiwan itself, which holds military exercises to practice repelling an invasion every year. This year's drills, however, were bigger and lasted longer and were better publicised than ever before.
So these are the MO6A3 tanks behind me that are fighting in the Taiwan Strait.
The Telegraph's Allegra Mendelson was there, so I asked her what it was like watching Taiwanese tracer fire arch into the sky just a few miles from the Chinese coast, and how close the threat of war feels in Taiwan itself.
Well, as you note, the Taiwanese, or as it's called here, the Republic of China military, but Taiwan more broadly, has been preparing for a possible invasion by China for many, many years now. And this year, they hosted the 41st Hanguan military drills, which are basically an annual way of testing everything that they have at their disposal in the event of an invasion. This year, the drills were the largest they've ever been in terms of scale and length. There were 22,000 reservists called to participate, and the drills lasted 10 days, which is double the length of the drills that they held last year. There was a lot of equipment and military tech on display this year. The new HIMARS units, they weren't fired, but they were brought out and set up for show. Taiwan received 11 of these units, which they've been broadcasting a lot about back in May. So that was a new development for this year's drills as well.
Okay, so an enormous number of people, and this is basically a practice for a dry run for the invasion. Where did you go? What did you see? And what can you tell us a bit about the scenario? Was it literally kind of the Chinese have landed and we have to repulse them? What was the scenario they were practicing? And did they have two sides? Was there one side playing the Chinese military and one side playing the Taiwanese military?
So some of the drills do simulate specific scenarios, and mind you, a lot of the drills aren't open to the public or the media, so we're only seeing this sort of after the fact in photos or videos that are being shared to us by the Ministry of National Defense. But the drills that are open to the media are typically rehearsed, more or less. And the ones that I attended, there was no other side. They were basically testing the responsiveness of their forces. So this year, a big theme was a lot of the drills were unscripted. So for instance, when I was on Kinmen or Jinmen Island, as it's called here, the soldiers that were staging the drill told us that a lot of the troops that were participating actually weren't told in advance what time they would have to be deployed. So they had to really think on their feet and act fast in a much more realistic way, like they would if there was a real attack. So that was one kind of, more realistic way that they were going about it, which is different this year from past years.
There's a great dispatch on the Telegraph website, and it's accompanied by a video dispatch, which it's really dramatic. I mean, there you are in your in your camouflage helmet and so on. It's just like a wall of tracer fire flying through the black darkness.
It's really, really loud here right now because there are also 4 armored vehicles right behind me, also firing at the same time into Taiwan Strait.
I mean, it looks like, the old footage of, the invasion of Iraq or Operation Desert Storm or something. It's really, really something. So where exactly were you and what was going on at that moment?
Yes, so in that video, I'm on Kinmen or Jinmen Island, which is at its closest point only about 2 kilometers away from China. It's one of Taiwan's outlying islands. So there's main Taiwan Island where you have the capital Taipei, and then there are several outlying islands, and Kinmen lies the closest to China. So in that clip, we were facing Taiwan's main island, but they were simulating what would happen if they were to be attacked by China. So in a realistic scenario, we would have been on the other side of the island, but obviously that's not possible because the ammunition would land in China if they'd been carrying out drills on that side. But we were on the beach and they were firing rounds. It kicked off the third portion of the drills, which were the live fire exercises. So they were firing real ammunition. There were CM-21 armored vehicles right on the beach. There was M60 tanks next to us, and we were very close. We were, right in between the armored vehicles and the tanks. So the earth below me was shaking. My ears were ringing. Felt very real in the moment.
Yeah, I was going to say, where is that ammunition going? Because I knew Kinmen's very near to China. It wouldn't really do to be firing tracer rounds into the Republic of China, I suppose, especially if you're trying to avoid a war. So this is interesting. I was wondering if you get into the context here, because you mention Kinmen obviously is one of these islands that, of course, Taiwan still kind of owns or controls, which are, really, really close to the coast of I mean, to put it in British terms for our British listeners, it's a bit like the Channel Islands, Jersey and Guernsey, right off the coast of France, closer to France than they are to us, but they're English. You're right close to China, just a couple of kilometres away, and you write in your piece that, obviously. You look on a map, it was always considered that was the front line. That's where a Chinese invasion would begin. And then you write that a lot of the soldiers are saying, well, they think that's no longer the case. Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, so this was a really interesting point that came up while we were on the island, speaking to both, ordinary civilians as well as soldiers who were stationed there, is, 30 years ago when China's military, the People's Liberation Army, was small and had, limited equipment, Kinmen would have been the front line because that was the easiest for them to reach. It made the most sense. But, now the PLA has grown into one of the largest militaries in the world. It has over 2 million troops. It has more tanks and fighter jets than the United States. So a lot of people were telling us that, listen, if China wanted to attack Taiwan, it could go straight for the capital, Taipei, or any other city on the main island. It wouldn't have to start with Kinmen, which would essentially give Taipei a heads up that, they wanted to attack. It would give more time for allies, for instance, the United States being a key one to deploy their troops and respond.
Could you tell us a little bit about Kinmen, opposite the People's Republic of China? What does it look like? What does it feel like? Is it quite a strange place, or is it kind of weirdly normal?
It's definitely a lot quieter than your major cities on Taiwan's main island. The streets are quieter, there are fewer people. Interestingly, there are far fewer troops than you might expect on an island that's been designated as Taiwan's front line. There were close to 100,000 before, and now there's approximately only 3,000. So that was, a pretty interesting, statistic to note. However, you do feel like you're surrounded by the military in a weird way. They've, turned old bases into museums, and there are quite a number of, military trucks that drive up and down the street. So it does, in some ways, feel like a front line in that sense, or at least an old front line. But in terms of kind of today and the day-to-day, it just feels like a quiet island, to be honest, with a lot of beautiful old architecture and a lot of beautiful beaches.
And do people go, are there ferries over to the mainland? Is there any contact with the People's Republic?
Yes, so the closest city in China to Kinmen is Xiamen, and there are regular ferries between the two. People coming from Xiamen to Kinmen, people going from Kinmen to Xiamen. So we spoke to a number of Chinese tourists who had come over for, a couple of days with their family just to see. And, for them, it's not coming to Taiwan because so many of them believe that Taiwan is part of China, that it's just, coming and exploring this island that's very accessible to them. And, they want to take their kids to the beach for a couple of days. And they're not thinking about the politics behind it that, you or I might.
Which is a remarkable thing, actually. I think we do kind of forget about there's huge amounts of human contact, right, between Taiwan and the mainland, despite all the political tensions. What did those tourists make of these military drills to repel the PLA?
Honestly, not a single one we spoke to had any idea they were going on.
It's interesting. But just focusing on where you are, these drills were the longest, they were the largest. How close does this this potential Battle of Taiwan, this hypothetical that we've all been talking about and worrying about for years, how close does it feel there? How close is it? Are we really in the zone where this might happen?
I would say, speaking to the average Taiwanese person, this is not necessarily something that they wake up thinking about every single day. I think in international discourse, especially in the international media, it's a big talking point when you look at Taiwan and Asia Pacific. But in terms of kind of the average person, this is a very vibrant city. It's a very vibrant country. And there's no kind of imminent sign here at the moment, except, these drills, for instance. I mean, these air raid sirens ring out across different cities, and you're expected to get inside or go into a basement and basically shelter as though, there was an attack. So yesterday, everyone in Taipei, and a couple other cities got a notification on their phone that said incoming missile attack. So they were really trying to make it seem realistic. So in those moments, it does feel very real, but on the average day, it doesn't. That doesn't mean it's not a huge threat that, the government is thinking about, the military is thinking about, that everyone should be thinking about and preparing for. And, this government in particular that was elected last May, they have sort of changed the way that they're preparing for this. One key way, in addition to expanding the size of these Hangguan military drills, is they've also run them concurrently with urban resilience exercises. So that means getting the average civilian prepared for an attack, and also equipping civilians with the ability to respond and, act as, for instance, medics, or, set up blockades, things like that, the average person might not know how to do, but should and could be helpful in doing in the event of an attack.
It sounds like the actions of a government who believe that the day is coming close when Xi Jinping will give the order for what he would call reunification. In your conversations with officials, do they believe that's what is about to happen?
It's very hard to say. I think, obviously, the number 2027, the date has been floated around quite a bit. That is, coming up soon. There's definitely...
Just for the context here, this was, I think it was an American intelligence assessment that said Xi Jinping had told the PLA they have to be ready to or able to do this operation by 2027.
Exactly. He basically had told his military he wanted them to be ready for 2027. That was not saying this is the date we're going to invade Taiwan. It was just a date that he wanted the PLA to reach a certain capability level. However, a lot of people have taken that number and interpreted it in different ways, one of which being that this is the year that, China will invade Taiwan. I do think that that's obviously on everyone's mind, and, there needs to be a level of preparedness in case that does turn out to be the case. I think there's also, a willingness from Taipei, to show the international community, specifically the U.S., that they are doing everything in their power. President Trump at one point had said that, Taiwan should increase its defense budget. He, during the election period, had said 10%, which is just, it's not feasible for a country like Taiwan. They're at like 2.5%. So hosting these kinds of military drills, showing that they're taking this threat seriously, and they're training their troops, and they're acquiring different types of equipment. They're building domestic equipment, I think, is also part of an effort to basically show the administration in the U.S., look, we're taking this threat seriously, and we're doing everything in our power to prepare ourselves.
Allegra Mendelson reporting from Taiwan there. Coming up, is one man's obsession with China and Taiwan changing America's foreign policy? Welcome back. Now, the threat of a war in the Pacific is affecting conflicts well beyond Taiwan itself. In Washington, it informs a consensus that America's major security challenge now lies in the Pacific, not in Europe. But within that consensus, there are still two schools of thought. The first says that all crises are interlinked, that a show of American weakness, vis-a-vis, for example, Russia in Ukraine, will only encourage China in the Pacific. But there is a school of thought that goes even further. It says the United States needs to concentrate resources in the Pacific, even at the expense of allies in other parts of the world. Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, is considered the intellectual driving force of that point of view, and he's recently been linked to a number of controversial decisions that have set alarm bells ringing in Allied capitals. Most recently, the surprise suspension of military aid to Ukraine, apparently based on the need to preserve America's own stockpiles. He was also reportedly behind the decision to review the $360 billion AUKUS submarine deal between the United States, Britain and Australia to see if it still fits with Donald Trump's America First agenda. Perhaps most controversially, he's even been accused of questioning America's commitment to Israel, a radical challenge to foreign policy orthodoxy, if true. But what makes Elbridge Colby tick? Where does his obsession with Taiwan and China come from? And is he really the man shaping Donald Trump's foreign and defense policy? Well, the Undersecretary himself is understandably busy, and we weren't able to get him on battle lines at short notice. So I turned to Neal Urwitz, a friend of Colby, who recently penned a piece defending him from the charge of abandoning Israel. I asked him to explain Mr. Colby's radical, some might say provocative, foreign policy philosophy.
While he and I disagree on a lot, I think our investment in Ukraine's freedom is an excellent one. He, has worries about prioritization. While we disagree on quite a lot, there's never any question in my mind that everything he does is deeply considered. His scales, if you were, are entirely based on what allows the U.S. to protect its national security interests globally and what is the prioritization that needs to happen to protect our interests where they most need protection.
His intentions are sound. You just think he's basically wrong about what he thinks needs to be done.
I would say he and I disagree. And this is the thing. I am concerned that American politics has driven off into a ditch of I'm right and you're wrong all the time. And that explains a lot of our partisanship. Despite the fact that Bridge and I are on opposite sides of the political divide, he and I can still talk and have an intelligent conversation. We disagree. His prioritization may be different than mine. He may think that there are trade-offs that I don't believe exist or that I believe aren't as stark as he thinks they are. That doesn't mean that he's wrong and I'm right, and it doesn't mean the vice versa. It just means that we are weighing things and weighing concerns differently. I don't for a minute think that there is anything nefarious in his thinking, which seems to be where our politics have gone, is anybody who disagrees with me must be in some way malintentioned. That's just wrong. And, I've known Bridge long enough to know that there's not an ounce of malice in him.
I think I wanted to ask you about his views, but I think maybe the best way to do that, I want to run past a couple of his more high-profile decisions past you and see if you can kind of put that in the context of where you think that came from in his philosophy.
One caveat that I should give, I have no knowledge of the internal workings of how these decisions were made. All I know is what's been reported. I can't provide any insights into whether he did actually make these decisions, whether they did emanate from his office. I'm not an insider.
Okay, that's fine. So the big thing is last week, this is from Politico, it was their scoop, to be fair to them. He's meant to have prompted last week's decision to halt shipments of some air defense missiles to Ukraine, which caught many Trump allies and lawmakers off guard. This week, Donald Trump said he would reverse the decision, or partially reverse the decision to pause weapons, but claimed he didn't know who had approved it. That's decision number one. Number two is a decision Colby also surprised top officials at the State Department and National Security Council in June when he decided to review America's submarine pact with Australia and the UK. also Politico reporting, which said it was a unilateral move by the Pentagon championed by Policy Chief Elbridge Colby. The official goal of the review is to see if the pact, AUKUS, this is the basically involves selling nuclear submarines to Australia, whether it is in line with President Donald Trump's America First agenda. The reason I bring those up and the reason they're controversial is because they've both kind of taken American allies by surprise, and people found them somewhat dismaying, I suppose. And you've already made clear, like, you can't say whether they were really his decision or not, but would those moves surprise you, or are those moves that you can see kind of fit into Elbridge's philosophy as far as you understand it?
First, I should say I would be very surprised if these are unilateral decisions. He's a collaborative person, at least in my experience. So while I respect the reporters from Politico a lot, I think they do terrific work, particularly their defense reporters. I'd be surprised if this was a straight up unilateral move, just knowing what I know about his personality, who he is. On the Ukraine piece, I know he has been very worried about trade-offs in ammunition for a very, very long time, years, many years. I'm aware of the review that said that Taiwan wouldn't actually need these munitions. If he did make this call, or if he did order this review, I'm sure he knows things that I don't. I mean, his security clearance is way up here. So, I don't think he just made an arbitrary decision of like, I don't feel like doing this anymore. I'm sure there was some trade-off for he felt that in order to continue to deter China from thinking about invading Taiwan, he thought those weapons were needed over there. If this was his, I can all but guarantee this was his thinking. As far as the AUKUS deal, this is another one that would very much surprise me if it was a unilateral decision, because the point of the AUKUS deal is to scale up Australia's ability to help deter China, which is Bridges' primary worry. So this one, I must admit, never made much sense to me. It doesn't fit, so I don't really understand why it's being routed back to Bridge.
I think those two answers give us a little, it kind of wedges open a door slightly into this question of his philosophy. And if I had a quick telephone call to the Undersecretary of Defense, believe me, I would interview him, but I don't. He's busy. We will try, but he's busy. So I'd really like you to help us then. So let's talk about his philosophy and his view of the challenges facing America that you say you've debated with him a lot and that you disagree with him about. Do your best to put his side of the argument then. What is it that animates him?
Yeah, he was very clear about this in his confirmation hearing, that he believes, and he's not wrong about this, that while we are still the preeminent power over China in the Indo-Pacific, America's security advantage has rapidly deteriorated over the last decade or so. China is pumping out new ships at a rate of 20 a year, new warships at 20 a year. They've even built for the first time a submarine capacity. They have gotten stronger. There is no question. And given the percentage of the economic activity that happens, given the importance of our Korean, Japanese allies, not to mention Taiwan itself, being in a position where we can no longer deter China is hugely problematic. And he thinks we've taken our eye off the ball. He thinks we have ignored China's growing strength for 20-something years now, and we got to play catch up. And that means really prioritizing deterrence, in the South China Sea and in the Asia Pacific more broadly. He's not subtle about this. If you go through his tweets from before he was nominated, he was warning about this multiple times a day. He was nonstop about it, and his book, Strategy of Denial, is all about that too. Like, what you see is what you get with Bridge, and he is not subtle about his concern.
I'm just curious now, where do you think that comes from? It sounds slightly obsessive. Is that an unfair word or no?
It's not obsessive. I make fun of him and say it is sometimes, but he would call it prioritization. And I know I keep coming back to that word, but, something like 90% of global trade goes through the South China Sea, and an enormous percentage of global GDP goes through that area. If China gets aggressive in that area, the damage to the global economy, to hundreds of thousands of people who would die in a war, it could be catastrophic. So he is very worried about what he thinks is a real concern that, with all due respect to the other national security issues that the U.S. has to engage with, this is an order of magnitude bigger from where he sits. And there is substantial bipartisan agreement on that. The House Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, which was, co-chaired by Mike Gallagher and a number of national security-minded Democrats, was arguably the most functional committee we have. There is bipartisan concern that we have taken our eye off the ball. And remember, every administration since at least Obama has talked about a quote-unquote pivot to Asia that we just keep getting dragged away from. And I think Bridge is determined to not get dragged away from the pivot to Asia.
That's good context, I think, because as you say, it has been going on for a long time. And what do you think he would say to someone like me, to put my cards on the table and not pretend that I'm disinterested here, that the idea of withdrawing US effort from Europe or from the war in Ukraine to concentrate on China is a complete fool's errand, because it just tells the Chinese that you're not really serious, you don't really stand by your allies, and actually the Chinese have a massive interest in Russia winning the war in Ukraine. How would he respond, do you think, to that?
So I think his answer, broadly speaking, is that it's time for Europe to step up. And for what it's worth, I think Europe is starting to. That's what you're seeing with the increased spending commitments from NATO countries. And, you're seeing it first and foremost with Poland, but also somewhat with Germany, of starting to put real money, actually appropriating money to build up their own defenses. What he would say is Europe's economy is many, many times the size of Russia's. There's no reason that Europe can't field its own forces to deter Russia. Now, I will admit that is a multi-year consideration, and defense industrial bases and militaries don't spring up overnight. But his answer, broadly speaking, is that deterring Russia should be Europe's responsibility. As far as the here and now, his argument would be, and I know I'm beating this to death, but I don't agree with his calculus here. But his argument would be China is more deterred by the idea of its ships getting sunk as they cross the Taiwan Strait, or its planes getting blown out of the air, or it's losing many soldiers in a ground invasion, than it is by a more abstract, did Russia win or lose in Ukraine? That's his argument. He may be right. He certainly has access to intelligence that I don't. But based on the publicly available information, I disagree with that assessment.
I think you articulated why as well. Or do you want a couple of seconds to say why you think he's wrong?
There are two things. Russia is China's junior partner, and having Russia siphoning off resources, extensive resources from China, and all but neutralized is a good thing. And it does send a message to China that this invasion might not go the way you think it would. And if you don't believe me, ask Russia, whose economy has been kneecapped, whose government revenues have gone way down, and who have lost hundreds of thousands of troops and, and tanks and planes, and emptied out their missile stockpile. I think if Putin could go back in time, he would not invade Ukraine. And that is an important message to get across to China of, even if you win, you might lose. So don't do this. Don't try to invade Taiwan.
I want to push on the there's kind of further implications of what you're saying of Elbridge's, or Bridge, as you say, your friends are. He's saying, look, we've got one overriding priority. It's China. We've got to focus on it. To that end, Europe's going to have to stand on its own 2 feet because we need to put stuff in the Pacific. Okay. How far does that go? Because in a way that means rewriting some of the orthodoxies of American foreign policy, one of which is this engagement in Europe. But what about the other orthodoxies? What about the Middle East? I mean, it's America just spent huge numbers of Patriot missiles in the Middle East shooting down Iranian rockets, right? Not really in Ukraine. That's where they spent them. Do you think it extends there? Do you think he was someone who would say maybe Israel should stand on its own 2 feet?
Well, and as I wrote in the piece defending Bridge on Middle East policy, the reason you reached out to me, I think his opinion is Israel is standing on its own 2 feet. Israel did the heavy lifting here. Israel took care of Hezbollah and Hamas, which were Iranian proxies. Israel took out all of Iran's air defenses so that the U.S. dropping the bunker buster bombs was risk-free for the U.S., tactically, operationally risk-free. There was no chance of an American pilot getting shot down. So I think his point of view is if Europe could be more like Israel, where Germany and Poland and the UK and France are checking Russia every which way, we'd be in much, much better shape. Israel spends north of 4% of its GDP on its defense. It has very honed, very advanced capabilities and intelligence community that is very much top of the line. His position would be Israel is taking care of this for the most part. So when they do need to call upon us, it's a much, much smaller lift.
Well, hold on a second. I mean, how many intercepts did U.S. naval ships and U.S. deployed air defenses carry out in defense of Israel in that war with Iran? It was colossal, wasn't it?
The Iron Dome did the heavy lifting. Now, that was developed in coordination with the U.S., and Israel, buys the interception missiles from U.S. companies. But yeah, there's no question that the U.S. was helpful here. But the heavy lifting was done by the Israeli military. And, to be blunt, there's no corollary to Europe's engagement in Ukraine. It is very difficult to argue that Europe has shouldered anything resembling the same load that Israel has shouldered vis-a-vis Iran.
But I mean, the main point I'm getting at here is it sounds like his rewriting of American commitments doesn't seem to extend to the Middle East.
No, I disagree with that. He's willing to leave the tip. He's not willing to pay for the whole meal. The U.S. engagement in Ukraine has been tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, which, again, I think is money well spent. The U.S. engagement vis-a-vis defending Israel has been a fraction of that. And Israel has, to use my analogy, paid for the meal. In Ukraine, America has paid for the meal. I mean, the Ukrainians themselves have paid for the meal, to be 100% clear. But when it comes to outside support, America has paid for the meal.
Let me put it another way. If America has to prioritize one region, one threat over others, even if he's saying, okay, we're not abandoning you, but we expect Europe to do more, we're going to have to withdraw support. We're not going to send as many air defense missiles, even though we promised them, so on and so forth. Wherever that is in the world, can America still be a superpower? Because isn't the point of a superpower is that you do operate everywhere in the world?
Well, with the caveat that here I am officially no longer speaking for Bridge. Not that I ever was, but now you're getting Neal's opinion. You're not getting Bridge's. Superpower or not, there are always limits on what any nation can do. I mean, the Roman Empire never invaded China. There are going to be limits to the power of any nation, no matter how powerful it is. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any question that Bridge and myself think that the U.S. needs to spend more on defense, because there's just a reality that we're in there are many more threats that we need to be able to deter against. I don't think he or I disagree that we need to dramatically reinvigorate our defense industrial base so that we can produce the sheer material needed to project force. But we're not there right now. That's just a fact. There are going to be trade-offs. We cannot project power everywhere. Even during the Cold War, there were places where we couldn't project power. And he wants to live in that. I hate using this word because it implies that everybody else is stupid. But there's a realism here of we have X number of troops, we have X number of ships, we have X number of missiles, and they can't be everywhere all at once.
Neal Urwitz talking to me there about his friend Elbridge Colby. We'll be back on Monday, further pursuing this theme with a special 3-part series looking at China's military. Those editions will be going out on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday next week. Please do tune in. And one extra reminder, if you wish to ask myself or Venetia Rainey a question, please do email in. We'll be holding a question and answer episode later this summer, and we are very keen to hear from all our listeners. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and Venetia Rainey. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others to find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin, and the executive producer is Louisa Wells.